All right.
So this is just a heads up for all the participants. We will be recording today's session. So if you, for whatever reason, do not like to be recorded, you can turn off your camera. But welcome everyone to the second session for the 2021 Academy of Management Research Methods Division Karma Doctoral Student and Junior Faculty Consortium. So today our topic is innovative approaches to collecting and sourcing data. My name is Jason Huang. I'm a representative at the Research Method Division at Academy of Management. And I also would like to acknowledge the support from Karma that enabled this this consortium to happen. So, Larry, I don't know if you want to say a few words before we start.
Oh yeah, I just would like to welcome everybody again on behalf of Karma and invite you to visit our website and get information about the different things that we do. As I said on earlier in the week, it's just very exciting to be engaged in this collaborative effort with the Methods Division. It was an important home for me early in my career, and it has remained so. And I congratulate you guys with the Methods Division on the success of this initiative. So thank you for working with us, and good luck to everybody. And it's especially nice to be working with my former colleague Jason on this one. Good to see you, man.
Thanks, Larry. So let's move on to today's agenda. For those of you who attended the first session, today our schedule is a little bit different. So we have 3 talks lined up today. And let me start introducing our first speaker, Dr. Scott Tony Dandel. He will be talking about best practices for creating a shortened scale. Dr. Scott Tong Dandel is a professor of management in the Bell College of Business at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and is a faculty member of the Organizational Science PhD program. Scott received his Master of Arts and PhD in Industrial Organizational Psychology from Rice University and his Bachelor's of Arts degree from Davidson College. Scott's research interests include issues related to leadership effectiveness, the impact of diversity in organizations, and research methods and statistics. His recent work focuses on people analytics and the interface of big data and the organizational sciences. He co-edited the PsyOp Frontier series volume titled Big Data at Work, the Data Science Revolution and Organizational Psychology, and recently completed work on an NSF-funded project that uses sensors to understand team interactions and the impact of diversity. Scott serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Business and Psychology, is a former associate editor for Organizational Research Methods, and is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, the American Psychological Association, and the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Scott.
Thanks, Jason. Really appreciate that introduction. Delighted to be here. Jason, can you let me share screen? There we go. Awesome. All right. So I asked Jason if I could go first here. In part because I have to bail from this session. So I want to apologize to the attendees and the other speakers that I'm going to drop off after my talk. But the good news is I'm going first, which means that this session can only get better from here. So you at least have that to look forward to after I'm done. It will definitely get better. Now, when you look at my title, you're thinking best practices for creating a shortened scale. And you're thinking, wait, I thought this was about like innovations in assessment and research and collecting data and so on. So I promise you that there will be some innovations when we get to the end. The stuff I'm going to talk about is really a collaborative effort from a pretty large team across multiple publications. So I want to acknowledge everybody's contributions down below. So how did this start? Well, this sort of started several years ago with this paper focused on how people are adapting their scales when they use them in their research. And so we had this paper that was published in 2019 in the Journal of Management. And when you take a look at that paper, there are a couple things that sort of came out of that. So one of the things that we did was we coded every scale in every article in a series of journals over a 2-year period. And what we were interested in doing was we're interested in like how people were modifying their scales in their publications. So what we found is pretty much everybody's modifying their scales, right? So 81% of the articles had adapted scales in some way. And if you think about, at the scale level, about half of the scales are being reported as being adapted. And one of the most common adaptions is in terms of shortening these scales. So about 10% of the articles of these scales were described as being shortened. Now, it's really important that this is self-reported numbers. So these are what the authors are saying, that they took a scale that exists and they shortened it, okay? But then we did this second study. And in the second study, we looked at some commonly used scales, and we looked at every time somebody made use of these scales. And because we focused on these scales that we knew, and we knew how long they should be and so on, we actually could see if they were adapted. And remember in study 1 that 8% of scales are being reported as being shortened. But when you know what the scales are and you can see how many items people use, you can see that that number is way off in terms of what people are doing. So in actuality, about half the time when people use a measure, it depends on what measure we're talking about, but about half the time when people use a measure, they're shortening it, okay? So, what does this mean for us? Well, this means that shortening is really common, right? So we're doing it about half the time with every other scale we use. And it's so common that we don't even talk about it. Right? We don't even mention doing it. We're mentioned doing it 10% of the time, but really doing it about half the time. And so essentially this notion of shortening a scale has become pretty accepted practice. Now, why is this happening, right? Well, one argument might be that to make some sort of theoretical contribution, what we need to do is we need to have more boxes and arrows in our models. And so we need to collect more measures. Maybe we need more constructs, but the other thing that we might need is just more measurement occasions, right? So you can think about like some sort of experience sampling methodology where we collect multiple measurements. So we've got more constructs, maybe more measurements, and the respondents don't have any more time, right? So we're still relying on respondents to complete these measures. And if we're increasing the number of constructs or the number of measurement periods, we need to do something to fix this. So we need shorter scales, okay? So we've got these shorter scales. We know people are doing it. And the question is, well, is this a problem? Like, should we care about this in any way? Well, we actually had a third study that was part of that scale adaptation paper where we asked editorial board members and psychometric experts to react to various adaptations that people might make. And essentially what we did was we gave them a bunch of scenarios. And in these scenarios, we asked like, how problematic is that kind of adaptation? And, to what extent might that adaptation impact the construct validity of the resulting scores that you're getting from making that adaptation? So we gave these scenarios out, we surveyed these psychometric experts, and here's an example of one on scale shortening, right? So you can imagine this is like something that you might see in an article, right? Like in your results section, you might say, oh, well, one of my measures was organizational citizenship behavior, and we measured it using this 28-item scale, but to minimize, the burden on respondents, we selected 7 of those items, okay? And we report our Cronbach's alpha, right? So that's probably something you all are pretty familiar with, right? You might see that in a results section. We asked these psychometric experts how problematic do they think this is? And what did we find? Well, across those 2 items that we talked about and across the different samples, again, these were editorial board members and psychometric experts, the most troublesome adaptation related to scale shortening. So essentially what we're saying here is that people are shortening scales. They're doing it very frequently. And when you ask psychometric experts and editorial board members about this behavior, and again, they're doing it so frequently they don't mention it, these psychometric experts think this is a problem. Okay, so we're doing it. It's a worrisome practice. Okay. Now, the next question might be, well, why do these editorial board members and psychometric experts think that scale shortening is a problem? Well, let's talk a little bit about how this might be happening. So, you know, if you look at some of the open-ended responses, here's a pretty good one from one of our psychometric experts related to the scale shortening scenario. They said, well, this individual would get a lecture from me on construct validity with a particular focus on content validity. I would question the validity of any inferences using this measure. You know, what do they really need to do? Well, they need to evaluate the psychometric properties of the shortened scale. Without that evidence, I would reject the paper. Okay. So that's a psychometric expert's response. And again, like, why, you know, is that a problem? Well, you know, one of the things that I think is important is to start thinking about like how people are shortening these scales, right? Because again, if you go back to that previous response, you know, if they are shortening the scale with proper psychometric evidence, this reviewer might be okay with it. So let's think a little bit about how people might be shortening these scales. Well, we don't know, but we're pretty sure that they're doing this to maximize alpha. Okay, so one of the things that we did was that we examined the internal consistency reliability of these 2,000 scales that we coded in that JOM article. And when you look at that, you find this sort of pattern here. You can look at the mean alpha for scales as a function of their scale length. Okay, and if you look at this table of alphas, you see something pretty interesting, and that is that alpha is largely unchanged, right? It doesn't really seem to change very much. Okay, so alpha's unaffected by scale length. Well, that doesn't really match what we know about measurement theory, right? Because measurement theory would say, as my scale gets shorter, my alpha should go down. Okay, so it suggests that authors are pursuing an alpha maximization strategy. Well, so then we looked at this a little bit further. Jason, I see there's something in the chat. I'm not going to be monitoring the chat, but maybe we can return to that a little bit later. So we looked in this a little bit further, and what we did was we looked at the correlation between scale length and alpha for scales published in JAP. And so we looked at every scale published in JAP at different time points. And so, for example, you can look back 30 years ago, and you see like, well, what's going on in 1989? And the correlation between alpha and scale length is 0.28. And in 2017, that correlation is 0.07. So that correlation's going down. And then you could say, well, what about scales that are being shortened, right? So when people report that they're shortening a scale, well, in 1989, when people are shortening a scale, what do you see? You see the correlation between alpha and scale length to be 0.66. So a pretty strong correlation. That's what we would expect. But again, you see that correlation being much, much smaller in 2017. So again, we see this pattern of the correlation between the scale length and alpha not really being consistent with what we know about measurement theory. Again, suggesting that people are pursuing some sort of alpha maximization strategy when they're shortening their scales. And again, if you think about like how people justify using their scales, well, again, that blurb that I gave you for that previous study here really describes how we justify our scales, right? We say, well, we use this scale that was previously published and we shortened it. And what makes that okay? Well, because my alpha is above 0.7 and it looks face valid, you know, that's essentially our justification, right? And, you know, we say, well, you know, what's wrong with that? Well, there are lots of things wrong with that. So, you know, where to begin? Well, I'd encourage you to take a look at another paper very much related to this, talking about the psychometric soundness of our scales. This should be, it hasn't come out in print yet, I don't believe, but it should be in online first, available at JAP, where you can really delve into some of these issues around alpha if you wanted to. But just as a quick summary, what do we know about alpha? Well, it's one aspect of scale quality, internal consistency, reliability. But as a measure of internal consistency, it's actually flawed compared to alternatives. So we actually have better measures of internal consistency if we wanted to use them. For example, lambda 2. Why do we use alpha? Well, I think it goes back to before we had these lovely little things called computers. It was way easier to calculate alpha. So what we did was we traded computational efficiency over accuracy. Right, and so we took convenience and focused on alpha instead of something like lambda 2. But if we want to know more about internal consistency, maybe we should be thinking about another measure of that. In addition, we know that alpha is driven largely by the inner item covariances. So there's no evidence of unidimensionality there. Again, we have measures that will tell us more about that, like omega or omega h. And again, when you think about our articles, we never talk about any of these things, right? We present alpha, we say alpha's above 0.7, and we move on, right? So again, how often do you see articles talking about lambda 2? How often do you see articles presenting omega? And again, this is not the first time we've said this, right? There's a great article by Cho and Kim in Organizational Research Methods in 2015 that is echoing these same things. We just haven't seen any movement on this. So again, how should we be evaluating our scales then? Well, if you think about a shortened scale, what things should you care about? Well, you should care about reliability, though not necessarily alpha. That might be one piece of it. But you also probably want to care about unidimensionality of your scale. You probably want to care about the correlation of that shortened scale with the overall scale, right? So some sort of part total correlation. You probably want to care about the convergent validity of that scale with other measures of the same thing, maybe discriminant validity of that scale with other measures of the same thing. And again, how about content validity, right? So what we're really talking about is moving beyond just the central singular focus on alpha to trying to create a shortened scale that attends to these multiple aspects of what makes for a good scale, right? We all know, we're all trained that these are things that make for a good scale. Yet when we shorten our scale, we really only focus on a single part of that first bullet point up there, right? So we really want to encourage people to attend to all of those things. And when you think about sort of attending to all of those things, it really resonated with me as being somewhat akin to what's called a Pareto optimization problem. And this is essentially a problem in engineering where you're trying to attend to multiple criteria to get to some sort of optimal solution. And that's really what we have. We want some sort of optimally shortened scale that attends to this larger variety of criteria in terms of evaluating that scale. So that sounds like what we want to do. Now it sounds hard though, right? So if only it were easy to do. Well, so this is where the innovation comes in. So what we've essentially done is we've created a little app that will allow you to shorten a scale using some pilot data and attend to all of these different constraints simultaneously. And we created this application in R-Shiny. So for those of you that aren't familiar, what R-Shiny is it's a little tool that our studio makes that allows you to create a little application that interfaces with R on the back end. So you can do all sorts of statistical computations on the back end, but you don't have to know anything about R, and it makes it in sort of this nice little user-friendly sort of package. So that's what we did. Now, the most important thing is how do we name this, right? Now, we were working with Jose Cortina at the time, and he suggested that we call this cutting or reducing tests is now automatic, because that spells out Cortina. We settled on something else actually, and that is Oasis. So what we want is we want this app that will allow you to select item subsets, and we want to optimize those item subsets amongst a bunch of criteria. So what I want to do is I want to spend the rest of my time here just doing a pretty quick tour through that Oasis app. And the way you get to this is there's a website on the UNCC Org Science page that has a bunch of resources that various people have created to do certain things. Some of those are Shiny apps, some of them are Excel files and so on, but one of them is about scale shortening. And there is the Oasis app and a user guide and an example data set. So I'm going to just sort of walk you through what this looks like. I'm not going to use the app itself. I basically just took a bunch of screenshots of the app because it does take some time to run these things. But we'll take a look and see what it would look like if you were actually using it. So let's take that app for a spin. So basically, if you go into the user guide says, hey, copy these 3 lines of code into RStudio, highlight them and hit run. And what that'll do is that will open up the app for you so you can make use of it. So when you hit run, you get this little interface here. And this is what a Shiny app looks like. So basically on the left side of my screen, you've got a little user interface where you can make selections. And in Shiny, those interfaces are adaptive, meaning as you make different selections, the options sort of change for you. So it's a pretty neat, slick looking tool. When you run the app and you ultimately say submit, your results are going to be displayed on the right side of that page. So, you know, the first thing you need to do is import a data set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run us through an example where we use the example data file that's on that resources page that I just showed you. And that is essentially an example around conscientiousness. So let's imagine that we have this 20-item conscientiousness scale that we want to shorten. Okay, so we have item level data for the scale. You know, let's imagine that we've already done all of the sort of data cleaning that we need to do, where we've taken items that are negatively worded and we've reverse scored them and all of that kind of stuff. And then let's say we also have a couple other bits of information that we collected. So let's say that we collected some data on another conscientiousness scale so we can look at convergent validity. Let's say that we have a measure of general self-efficacy that we might use for discriminant validity. Now, admittedly, this isn't sort of a perfect measure, but that's the data we had available. So we're going to use that for our demonstration here. And so for both of these things, let's say we've already calculated for those 2 things, the composite score. So we've got a composite score for convergent validity, a composite score for our measure that we're going to use for discriminant validity. So our data sort of looks like this. So those are our 20 items. And then we've got the other conscientiousness measure and the general self-efficacy measure. Okay, so once you upload your data, then you would choose the items that you want. And again, on that select item box, it'll be populated, the list, there'll be a list there that will be populated with all of the columns in your data set. So you basically just click the columns that you want. So I'm going to choose all 20 of those. Then you can decide how long do you want this shortened scale to be. So I can say, well, I want it to be at least 4 items, but no more than 6 items long. You can say what are the columns that represent your convergent validity measure? What are the columns that represent your discriminant validity measure? You can elect whether or not you want to calculate omega H. Other things we calculate automatically, but the calculation for omega H can take some time, especially the way that this application works, where we iterate through a bunch of different combinations. So you actually have to elect to want to look at that. The other thing that this application does is it allows you to do something that we call content mapping, which is, you know, if we look at this conscientiousness scale, there are some items that ask about industriousness and some items that ask about orderliness. And if you really want to capture the entire content domain of the scale, you actually need items from each of those dimensions. Otherwise, you might just end up with 4 to 6 items from one of those. And so what you can do is you can say, yes, I want to do content mapping. And when you do that, again, it'll change that interface and it'll say, well, how many content areas do you have? And then based on how many you choose, then you can choose which variables correspond to which of those areas, right? So the first 10 items correspond to one of those. The second 10 items correspond to the other one of those dimensions. The other thing that you can do here is you can take, if you care about this, you can take item polarity into account, right? So if you wanted to make sure that your shortened scale had some negatively and positively worded items, you can do that as well. So you would say, yes, I want to, and then you would indicate which ones are negatively and positively worded and how many of each you wanted. So you can, again, sort of take into account all of these different features when choosing your shortened scale. Now, what happens when you say submit is essentially R will in the background go through and look at every single possible combination of those scales. So you basically get something that looks like this, where it starts off with all 4-item combinations. Here, some of them listed here: the alpha, the lambda 2, the part whole correlation, the correlation with your convergent scale, the correlation with your discriminant scale, and then how many items are in each of those content areas. And, you know, with 20 items, there are 60,000, you know, different combinations of 4 to 6 items that you could use, right? And so that's essentially what this program does, is it iterates through all 60,000 of those and calculates all of these statistics. And then what you can do is as you click through the results, you can click on each one of these different columns, and you can basically get the slider bar where you can adjust the slider bar to narrow your results down to different amounts. So right now, again, it's looking from 4 to 6, but I can slide that over. And so right now my alpha values go from 0.41 to 0.9, but I can use that slider bar to constrict those and so on. So I can go through each one of these and choose like, okay, well, how do I want to limit what I'm seeing here, kind of thing. So let's say that, well, I want a 6-item scale and I want 3 industriousness and 3 orderliness items on my 6-item scale. So what I would do is I'd slide that slider bar all the way over to 6. I would slide the slider bar to 3, and all of a sudden now I'm down to 14,000 scales. And then what I could do is I could say, well, you know, I need an alpha above 0.7 because the reviewers won't like anything where my alpha is below 0.7. So again, I can slide that slider bar over and reduce the number of scales that I get even further. And then what we can do is we can say, okay, well, what does it look like in terms of the convergent validity? Convergent divergent validity coefficients. You can see there's quite a big range of values for these across these different scales. And again, you probably don't want to choose a subset of items that correlates more highly with generalized self-efficacy than it does with another measure of conscientiousness, for example, right? So you could think about constraining that. And again, you don't necessarily need to choose the one with the lowest discriminant validity, but you might want to choose one that has a value that matches what the real scale looks like, right? Again, if we're trying to sort of replicate what that real scale looks like. So again, you can think about like, hey, there's this 6-item measure. It's got good alpha, good lambda 2. The part whole correlation is sort of okay. The convergent validity is probably pretty bad though, but the discriminant validity looks a little bit like the full scale, right? And again, what you can do is you can sort of constrain different things, right? So we might say, okay, well, I want, you know, alpha above 0.8, a part whole correlation a greater than 0.85, a convergent validity greater than 0.8, and maybe discriminant validity between 0.55 and 0.65, because again, that's sort of about where the full scale is. Well, now I get down to like 76 items, or 76 different scales, right, that I could choose from. And you know, you could look at the choice with the highest alpha if you wanted to. This is what it looks like. You can see that those, you know, reliability, you can see that those reliability estimates are lower than the full scale, which again is what we would expect. So again, that's not out of the ordinary here. You know, but you can see that a lot of those other statistics, again, just to back up a second, sort of match what the full scale looks like. So I got a really good part whole correlation. My convergent validity is pretty close to what we see in the full scale. My discriminant validity is pretty close to seeing what we see in the full scale, and so on. We can look and see what those items are and make a decision about like, oh, is that the way to go? So essentially, to wrap up, you know, what I'd really like to see is I'd really like us to take more seriously our measurement. Right. And again, what we do is we sort of think about this as an afterthought. You know, I've got this scale that somebody else used. I'm just going to cut it. As long as my reliability is good, I'm done. And what I'd really advocate for is that we take this much more seriously. And how do we take this more seriously? Well, again, we can collect some pilot data. try and attend to some of these other critical aspects of our measures when trying to decide how to shorten our scales. So that's all I got. I will stop sharing now. And Jason.
Scott, we had a couple of questions about the app, and I guess it would be a good time to first address those questions before answering other questions. So the first question is more of a comment. Is it true that Oasis only allows one convergent validity measure and one discriminant validity measure?
Yeah, right now it's just set up for one of those things. Now, I guess you could, so there are some tricks you could do, right? Like, so one trick is, let's say you had two convergent validity measures. You could set one up as the convergent and one up as the discriminant, and then just try and like maximize that kind of thing. So that might be a trick. It really is from a shiny programming perspective. It's hard to program this for like every possible option that people might want to use. But I do think that this does handle a bunch of reasonable cases. And again, it is something that we'd like to sort of keep improving, right? So, you know, as more people use it, as we get some feedback, we can definitely take that into account, and depending on how easy or hard it is to implement one of those. So if you're somebody who's using Oasis and has a feature that they like, by all means, send me a message and I, you know, sort of add it to the list, and perhaps it's something that we can add to in the near future.
And a second question on the app is, does Oasis use actual Pareto optimization algorithms?
So it doesn't, because that requires coming up with weights for each of those things. And again, you may value some of those dimensions more or less in a certain circumstance. So we didn't really feel like it was appropriate for us to assign those weights, but you can essentially weight things based on, again, how you, as you titrate down the different options that are looking good, you can sort of sort by particular options that you think are more important, and then choose those scales that are more heavily weighted toward those different aspects.
Okay, the other questions are a bit more conceptual or from the design perspective. So the first question is about the review process. If so many reviewers feel scale shortening is such a trouble, why did they not reject all such shortened measures?
Well, so I mean, I think that that's an issue in general with our field, right? Like, so I think a lot of times we apply certain sort of gatekeeping principles to certain things, right? And not others, right? So for some reason, we've decided to apply, you know, this rule of, well, alpha has to be above 0.7, right? And so if alpha is 0.699, you know, that I'm gonna, as a reviewer, make a comment about how you have low alpha, right? But if alpha is 0.71, all of a sudden I'm gonna say, well, you meet this minimum threshold, and so I'm not gonna comment at it. And I think, again, like, part of that is that it's, that's easy, right? Like, it's really easy for the reviewers, doesn't take much cognitive load to apply that kind of criteria to evaluating your article. Whereas it becomes much harder to evaluate your measure. You know, one is I may not even know that you shorten your measure, because you only mention it about 20% of the time when you actually do it, right? Like, so that's one of the things that we know, is that you only mention that you do it some of the time. I think, as a general rule, we don't necessarily institute the kind of standards that we need in terms of our measurements, right? Again, I would say that a lot of the time, our justification for using a measure is that someone else used it. And that seems to be accepted by the gatekeepers as sufficient validity evidence, right? Someone else used it, so it must be okay for me to use it, even though we don't necessarily know why the people before used it, right? Or what validity evidence was necessarily associated with the scale before. And again, part of the reason we don't know that is, again, it's just hard, right? Like as a reviewer, you say you use this previous measure. Well, does that mean I need to go back and look at that previous measure and look and see what validity evidence they had? And then I need to see like, well, how does your measure look compared to theirs? Did you adapt it, and in what ways and how? And so, you know, I think that I would love to see reviewers care about this more. And I think that certain reviewers do. And again, I think that the reviewers that we were talking to were, again, tended to be more psychometric experts, you know, board members of organizational research methods. And so I think they care about those issues more than maybe a reviewer at a non sort of methods focused journal. But I do think that, you know, again, one of the things that we advocate in both of these papers is for reviewers and editors to hold authors a little bit more accountable for these sorts of scale development decisions that they make or justifying their scales. But again, I mean, I think authors need to take some responsibility as well, and not just do the bare minimum that the reviewers will let through the process, and instead think more about producing high quality measures to enhance the quality of the rest of their study.
I do think using this app is a good way for us to ensure any measures we shorten will have high psychometric properties that's at least comparable to the original scale. Now, we have two questions on the lack of data for this app, and I wonder if you could comment on this. What if we say, I as a researcher, I'm interested in using this app, but I don't have the data. What can I do in this case?
Well, I mean, I think you need to get some data, right? Like, I mean, again, like, I don't think you can legitimately shorten a scale without collecting any data. And the reality is it's not that hard to collect survey data now, right? I mean, I think we can collect a large amount of survey data quite easily, especially if we're talking about using this data for pilot purposes, right? Again, that's what we're talking about, right? So we're not talking about using this data to test hypotheses. You don't necessarily need to do any sort of fancy manipulations. You don't necessarily need to get the exact sample, you know, if you're looking at sort of a very specific kind of sample that might be really hard to get. But here we're talking about collecting some pilot data to evaluate the psychometric properties of your scale. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say, well, run a little pilot study on an MTurk or, you know, one of these other websites that allows you to collect data from human subjects using surveys and leverage that data to evaluate your scales.
I know you have to go, but there's probably one last question here. It's a pretty long one. On the conceptual level, if not philosophical ground, if a scale consists of truly reflective items, would it be possible that the answers of a few items can arguably, or at least be construed as representing a latent construct?
Oh boy, I mean, I think the formative versus reflective sort of construct is I think that's a whole nother debate, I think. And, you know, I don't think the process that we're talking about here is necessarily applicable to both of those, right? So again, we're really talking about using, you know, sort of measurement theory where we've got a construct and those those indicators are being caused by that latent construct. So I guess I haven't really thought about how you would do this otherwise. So I guess I don't really have an answer. I think that would probably run way into the other speaker's time, but I think that's a good question.
Thank you for your time, Scott.
Yeah.
Let's give Scott a round of virtual applause if possible, but really appreciate your time today, and this has been very informative.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye, Scott. Okay, give me 1 second. So our next speaker is Ryan Cross, and he's going to talk about innovating with data in corporate governance research. Ryan is an associate professor of strategy at Robert and Edith Shoemaker Junior Faculty Fellow in Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the Department of Management and Leadership at Texas Christian University. He received his PhD and bachelor's degree from Indiana University. His areas of expertise include boards of directors, strategic leadership, top management teams, stakeholder management. He is an associate editor at Journal of Management and an editorial board member at Academy of Management Journal, Strategic Management Journal, Organization Science, Journal of Management Studies, and Organizational Research Methods. So I'll turn it over to Ryan, and Ryan, like we did earlier, I'll be monitoring the chats and feed the questions your way when we're in the Q&A session.
All right, thanks, Jason. I'm really happy to speak with you all today. I'm excited by, there's like 116 people on this call, so I really gotta commend Jason, the organizers, for putting together a great panel. I'll try not to bring the quality down too much with my presentation here. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. Are you all seeing a PowerPoint presentation? Okay.
Yes, Professor.
All righty. Let's see. Does that look right? Okay. You can never quite tell. Well, yeah, thank you for having me. So this presentation was titled "Innovating with Data in Corporate Governance Research," and as I started making the presentation, I decided to change the title to "Innovating with Data in Corporate Governance Research," because none of the stuff I'm going to talk about today is really an innovation. At least I don't think it is. And those of you who do qualitative research or micro research are going to look at these things going, none of this is innovative, and which is true. But it's stuff that historically has not been done very much in corporate governance research, and so it's new to us. And so my goal today is not really to tell you anything you can't get from other sources on other methods, but to talk a little bit about the challenge in doing corporate governance research, and then what some of the more recent research is doing to try and get around those challenges. And I'll hopefully get through it pretty quickly, and we can just talk, we can just have questions. So when I say corporate governance, for those of you who aren't in this space, we're talking about primarily boards of directors as the unit of analysis, and to some degree executive teams, to some degree shareholders, institutional owners, and that sort of thing. But the nexus of all of this is the board of directors, who serves the governance function at any kind of almost really any corporation, including nonprofits and many private companies and things like that. But our focus tends to be on publicly traded companies, mainly because we can get the data, as you'll see in a second. And the big challenge with corporate governance research is, from a behavioral research standpoint, we have a black box problem, which is that we have all these theories about how boards work, how the members of the boards interact with each other, how they interact with executives who it's their job to oversee, how they interact with outside stakeholders like investors, etc. Almost all of our theories include assumptions and really are focused on those interactions, which we almost never measure. Right? We look at the visible attributes and structures of the board, and as well as the top management team. Who's leading them, how they're compensated sometimes, diversity in terms of demographic characteristics, things like that, all stuff that are visible attributes and structural attributes, because that's what we can see. That's what we can get from a non-obtrusive investigation, right? We can look at data that are publicly available and try to draw conclusions about what's happening inside the board from those. There's been a lot of research using that, decades of corporate governance research using those methods, and we have a lot of great insights that have come from it. The theory has advanced on the backs of such data, but I would argue that we're getting a bit to the end of the road on what we can do with that. I would say that it's becoming more, it's now constraining our theory. Whereas before, it was the only way to test and advance our theory. It's like, well, it's the only data we can get. Now I think the constraints of those data are actually constraining theory development, and the field is looking for ways to move beyond it. So when we typically see governance research, we have what I call the usual suspects. And one of the great things about corporate governance research is that we have a lot of data that we can use, right? It's not necessarily the greatest data, but we have it. And we use these databases predominantly. ExecuComp, which is administered by CompuStat, which is administered by S&P, I think. That's a good source of executive compensation data, some demographic information about top managers. BoardX is becoming a very frequently used database. It's got a lot of information about director attributes and roles on the boards. MSCI, which used to be called Corporate Library, same thing, board attributes, director attributes. These are great databases, and I've used them a lot. We have a lot of research that builds off of them. But it's becoming more and more difficult to identify ways to have a theoretical contribution using just these data sources, because really all of these data are pulled from public disclosures. Corporate, public companies file annual reports and proxy statements to the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. It's got all this information about who's on their board, what their backgrounds are, what they're paid, all that sort of stuff. And these companies essentially, collect all this information that's in these disclosures and these PDFs, put them in a nice database for us. So the field is starting to kind of, it has for the last several years been moving beyond this in some ways, trying to get into that black box a little bit, trying to get a little bit more granular understanding of what's going on in the boardroom or what's going on between actors in the corporate governance equation. So, there's been quite a good amount of research using what I'll call the slightly less usual suspects, which is taking publicly available text sources and using various forms of content analysis to glean more richer, more in-depth qualitative understanding from the text. And so personally, I've used proxy statements, which are the annual disclosure that companies have to provide to the Securities and Exchange Commission, talking about who's on their board, what they're paid, how they're structured, all that sort of stuff. Other scholars have used the annual CEO letter to shareholders and have used computer-aided content analysis on those to glean all sorts of psychological attributes, both sort of dispositional and situational, about the CEO from the language they use in their letter to shareholders. And then something that's becoming very popular is using Analyst conference call transcripts. So every quarter, typically public company CEOs and a few other executives will do these conference calls with stock analysts after they release their earnings. And why these are great is that there's a prepared remarks, but then there's the Q&A with the analysts. And that's really special because it's kind of extemp, right? It's not scripted, right? So you can really, if you're trying to capture like personality information about the CEO, it's a really kind of cool way to do that. To give you a sense of what some of this looks like, I'll use my example of taking proxy statement data. So I research primarily board leadership. I'm interested in the role of the board chair and other board leaders. And so for my dissertation, I collected proxy statements for the S&P 500. And around the time I started work on my dissertation, the SEC very helpfully started requiring companies to explain why they either had a combined CEO, chairman of the board, or a separate CEO and chairman. And so I collected these passages of text from the proxy statements and I coded them by hand, reading them, coded them by hand for different orientations toward the role of the chair. So here's an example of what I call the control orientation. And you can see the bolded language here, talks about enhancing oversight. We have a separate chairman from the CEO to enhance oversight, independence, those sorts of things. And I contrast that with what I call the collaboration orientation, which also is for a separate CEO and chairman, but focuses more on things like freeing the CEO up to focus their time, effort, and energy on running the business, having a delineation of responsibilities, supporting the CEO, helping the CEO, that kind of stuff. So this was an opportunity to take existing theory we had in corporate governance about this whole control collaboration distinction and try and get at it a little bit more directly than just looking at something that's visible from the outside. But it's still using publicly available information to code data. So I want to talk a little bit with the rest of my time about what I see as primary data and what I'll, again, innovations, right? None of these are actually things that other people aren't doing. But they're very new to us. And so there's some really, really cool research going on right now, mostly by other people, not me. But I'm doing some stuff I think is pretty cool too. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff going on. So, everybody should be familiar with these various methods. You got of getting primary data. You got your surveys, your experiments, your interviews / grounded theory, and then observational studies of actual or simulated situations. And so I'm just going to talk about these a little bit. So I have a project that I'm working on right now that we started when COVID first hit, and we wanted to understand board chair directive leadership during a crisis, right? And so we saw an opportunity after we got over the first kind of few weeks of shock of COVID. We're like, all right, there's maybe an opportunity here to survey boards. Everybody's sitting at home in front of their computers. Maybe they have a little time. They could fill out a survey maybe. And so we had this model of how board chair directive leadership would impact response to a crisis and performance during a crisis and that sort of thing. And so what's important about this is, the method that we used, it's sort of assumed in corporate governance research that you can't do surveys. There are some people who've had a lot of success with this and developed a lot of great theory, like Jim Westfall. He's had an amazing career of surveying the corporate elite. Most of us lowly humans are operate under the assumption that you can't do that, right? You just can't do it. And so, you know, we kind of put this to the test. One of the nice things about these databases is that some of them have contact information for corporate directors. And so we sent a survey to about 10,000 directors who we could get usable contact email address from the corporate affiliations database. So if you have access to that database, it's got this contact info in there, representing 2,000 public companies. And we got responses from about 170 directors, which is a response rate of about just under 2%. And if you're an OB person, you're like, if you're a governance person, I'm throwing a parade over that. That's Christmas right there. And especially, then if you think about it as one of the cool things about surveying boards is if you're asking things that are at the board or company level rather than the individual level, if you're not overly concerned about, getting multiple respondents to validate something, you've got like an average of 10 bites at that apple, right? So if you send a survey to everybody on a board, average about 10 people, if you're looking for the same information from everybody, you got about 10 shots at that company. And so as you can see here, we had a few multiple responses from different boards, but 7.2% of our firms responded, right? Which is a really, really cool response rate for a governance study. So and then the nice thing is, because these are public companies, we're able to combine the responses with archival data, right? And then follow these companies over time and look at their performance, and we don't have to go back to them, right? Because this is this is the thing with surveying the corporate elite. You get one shot at that, right? Trying to get them to fill out a second survey for more results, forget it. Am I doing it at time? Okay. And then, so we combine this with archival data here from different databases. This is the opportunity, right? If you can get that primary data, publicly traded companies, there's so much other data out there you can combine with it. So what I learned from the last talk is that shortened scales are great, and you should all use them. As you can, we use this scale of directive leadership, and so when you're surveying the corporate elite, you absolutely want a shortened scale, because these people will not spend more than about 5 minutes filling out your survey. And as you can see in our scale of directive leadership, we clawed our way across the 0.7 threshold of Cronbach's alpha, so everything's fantastic. And but I will say we did shorten this from Yoon et al.'s measure of directive leadership, but we only shortened it. The only things we excluded were things that aren't applicable to the board chair. So this is something you got to do if you're trying to get primary data from the corporate elite. Is most of these measures for surveys are not designed for the work that boards do, and so you have to adapt it. And so as you can see in these items here, first of all, we were surveying both board members and board chairs, and board chairs are not the supervisors for boards. So they're kind of first among equals. So it's a weird relationship, kind of, applicable, kind of not, which is what makes studying leadership in that context really interesting. But for example, we had to exclude the questions, any questions about managing rewards, because the board chair doesn't manage rewards for the board. The board chair cannot dismiss board members. So there's aspects of directive leadership that just weren't applicable. So we had to exclude those. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And we did, this is the factor analysis here is distinguishing it from participative leadership, which we also measured. So, learning how to do survey data here as a macro person, it's fun. So that's an example of surveying boards where I think, it may actually be more feasible than we think it is. You can do experiments. So I have a paper here that was published a couple of years ago at SMJ, with some colleagues at universities in China, and this was a virtually administered experiment, but it was an experiment. We used sort of a vignette-based experimental instrument, which I think you kind of have to do if you're trying to get actual directors to respond, unless you're going to bring them to school and do some sort of group activity. But it was really interesting. We administered it as a survey, but it was just individual people who are serving on corporate boards, and we asked them to go through a couple of vignettes saying, okay, if you're on a board and the CEO presents you with the following information, and they got sort of a whole description of a proposed merger, and we manipulated a couple of things: the transparency of the board decision making. And so in China, any dissenting opinions are published. They're made public. We don't do that in the US. And so this was sort of the impetus to do this study: is how do directors respond to does transparency make them act differently, right? And so we manipulated, we primed them to think about different approaches to governance, and then also manipulated whether they were told that this decision will be made public or not actually, but within the vignette. And it changed the way, it sort of changed who they were signaling for. There's sort of a dual labor market for directors. You're either signaling that you're a good governance person, or you're signaling that you're a person who likes to go along to get along, and that makes you a nice, friendly board member. And so depending on how we primed them and whether it was public or not, it changed how they said they would act, how they said they would dissent or not dissent in a boardroom discussion. So that one was interesting, and I really do encourage people, if you can get the participants, experiments are a really, really, I think, underused approach. There's some excellent interview-based qualitative research out there. None of it is mine, so it's probably really good. And but I encourage you to look at a couple of recent papers. Hopman et al., AMJ, does a qualitative study of, I want to say, 5 boards of, I think they're electric utility companies in Switzerland. And they develop a whole model of the board's role in either staunching organizational inertia or essentially facilitating organizational inertia. And they have an interesting, they find all sorts of interesting information in there about the board chair's role, which I think is cool in that process. But we just don't have a lot of qualitative research yet on boards, because I think there's generally been the attitude that you need to be in the room observing the board, which is nearly impossible, particularly in the US. No corporate counsel worth their salt is ever going to let you in their boardroom. Very recent paper just showed up online by Bovey et al. Has, I think, an amazing, uses a grounded theory approach to study directors' implicit theories of their roles and duties as board members. I think it's a fabulous paper. You should go check it out. And what's cool about that is they're not looking at specific boards and studying them and their progress or their process like the Hopman paper did. Kathy Eisenhardt's got some research doing similar things with entrepreneurial boards. This one was was interviews with a bunch of different directors from different boards, and kind of looking at them at the individual level, which again opens up a lot of data collection opportunities, because if you don't have to get the whole board, you can it's much more feasible to collect that data. And then something cool that I'm working on right now, including with a PhD student who's on this call, Dana Beeman, is since it's very difficult to observe actual boardroom discussions, you can simulate boardroom discussions. Ideally, you would do this with actual directors, not necessarily with their actual board, but you get people who know what they're doing, put them in a room, do a simulated discussion on a vignette topic, and you observe them. And so this is with my former colleague at TCU, Mary Waller, who has done a ton of simulation-based team studies. It's really most of what she's done in her career is these simulation studies. And essentially, you get experts, you get knowledgeable people, put them in a room, give them a vignette, and record, video or audio record their discussion. And you can do sort of a qualitative/quantitative analysis of what they say and the sort of the trajectory of conversation, all that sort of thing. It's really, really cool. And you can gauge the team dynamics going on in the room. At the end of the day, boards are more team-like than a lot of teams that we study, because everyone's sort of on equal footing. They all have the same objective, that kind of thing. So, that's something we're working on right now. We had, we began with sort of 8 5-person teams of executive MBA students. Again, ideally you're using, directors, but sometimes it's easier to get executive MBA students. So we tried that, and it worked really well. We assigned students to the role of director, and one was assigned to be CEO chair. And the whole point of the vignette was an activist is trying to trying to get the board to separate the CEO and board chair positions. And we manipulated whether they were looking at high firm performance data or low firm performance data. And one of the nice things about this is that, they're in your room, they've agreed to do this, you can give them a lot of information. And so we were able to, see all sorts of cool stuff in the discussion by audio recording what they did. And, it's interesting. One thing we found was that teams sort of immediately attended to either the CEO who's in the room or the shareholder who's outside, this fictional shareholder, but not both. And that immediate sort of gravitation of the attention sort of determined, which way they went in terms of agreeing to the analyst or the activist demand versus resisting it. So that project is ongoing. But I encourage people to look into some of Mary Waller's research on simulated team studies, because I think that opens up a lot of opportunities as well, not just in corporate governance, but in team research in general. Okay, so big takeaways here. As I said before, I think theory in corporate governance is becoming actually more limited by this focus on these usual databases rather than facilitated. At a certain point, just having the data and being able to make assumptions about these proxy measures facilitated theory development. I think that it's now becoming a constraint. And so I think we need to really move on beyond it, and we are moving beyond it. Textual data provides good opportunities to open the black box, and it is much more accessible than primary data. So it's if you're looking to do research in this space, you have a good foundation now of published work that's looking at publicly available text data. I mean, there's just so much text out there now. There's, whether it's, transcripts of calls or interviews or whatever, as well as company disclosures, all that sort of stuff. But primary data provide potentially richer opportunities, and I think they're more available than we sometimes think. I think there's a lot of assumptions about the inability to access boards and executives, and yeah, it's hard. It is a challenge, but I also think that it's not impossible, and it can be extremely rewarding and really thought-provoking if you do it. So I will end there.
Thank you, Ryan. We do have a few questions in the chat, and they're pretty long. So do you want me to read them out? Maybe it works even for people who will be watching the video later on. So let me do that. So first question, for a firm level study, should we go for a single shot, single respondent survey, or multiple respondents in the same firm, at least 2 from each firm? Or can we go for a cross-sectional design using single respondent at 2 time intervals? For example, collecting IV at one time and DV and moderators at another time. Can we collect IV from one respondent from one employee and DV from another employee? My potential respondents are CEOs or business owners in family firms in SME segment.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great question, and I would say that it depends on the research question, right? It depends on if you're trying to just gauge information about the firm in general, then you're always going to run in, if you're using a survey, you're always going to run into reviewers who say you should have multiple respondents. And ideally, yes, you absolutely should have multiple respondents, but that is a goal, but I don't think it should be a deal killer. If your constructs are relating to firm level information. Now, the more subjective they get, the more you need multiple respondents, right? Because you're getting closer and closer to a place where you're just capturing the opinion of one person. And so now if your respondents are CEOs, again, it depends on what you're trying to measure, but the CEO is a really good respondent for anything about the firm. One challenge you run into with surveying executives beyond the CEO is that they predominantly know their chunk of the organization. So unless you're asking them about their experience on the top management team, which they can talk about, but again, that's going to be somewhat subjective. If you want to know about the whole firm, the CEO is the best person to ask. Of course, they're also the hardest person to get a hold of. The nice thing about boards is that for the most part, board directors all do the same job on the board. Yeah, there's people on this committee or that committee, but they're all collectively responsible for the organization. So they're kind of a good source of information about the organization. And they're not nearly as busy as executives because a lot of them are retired and it's a part-time gig. So I encourage you to think about maybe surveying board members as a way to hopefully get a response from, at least one response from an organization.
So the next question is about response rate. So the statement goes like this: I do agree with Ryan that in the context of TMT, CEO, board level surveys, response rate that is not 0 is already cool. I have a terrible memory when I was a master's program student when startup executives just closed the survey as soon as I provided information about requesting multi-source ratings. Having said that, I also have a question in that regard. What did you do or would you have done if a reviewer still wanted some evidence that defends the lower response rate? Maybe showing that respondents versus non-respondent groups are identical in terms of demographics. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean, definitely that, right? So again, the beautiful thing about surveying boards is we have a lot of information about these people, right? We have demographic information about them. We know how long they've been on the board. We know whether they're the chair or the committee chair or something like that. So yeah, showing, using things like the Kolmogorov, Smirnov, I think it's that, or either that or it's, I'm getting confused with the vodka, but that, tests of essentially difference in the distribution of these variables between respondents and non-respondents, and things like that, and trying, to show that there's also, we used in that survey, we used response weights in the analysis. And so you can use a first stage equation to predict the likelihood that a person responds based on their characteristics. And then you can use that propensity score as a weight in doing the analysis. So that's another way of doing it as well.
I'm going to move around the question a little bit. The next question will be, the social forces of the board might influence directors' behavior. How can we replicate the socialized environment of the board on the simulation?
Yeah, so that is probably the biggest challenge with using simulations, is that if your theory has to do with any kind of pre-existing social relationships, simulations aren't going to work for you. And a lot of board work is driven by the pre-existing social relationships and the social dynamics among the board members. And so that is a definite limitation of using simulations. What we were trying to get at was, sort of a bit of a shock to the system and saying, okay, an outsider has made this demand on you. What do you think we should do? But, it is a limitation in that, one board is going to be really cohesive and they're going to all, kind of rally around each other and say, we're fine, this outsider doesn't know what they're talking about. And another board's going to be really contentious and one side's going to take the outsider's position and one isn't, that sort of thing. So, unless you are using, and you could do this, unless you are using an entire board in an actual board, but doing a simulation, which, if you have a really, really strong exec ed program that has those connections and can do that as like board training, which would be really cool, you could do that. Short of that, you probably want to limit it to things that don't necessarily rely that much on the sort of team dynamics and the social dynamics.
Thanks. The next question is about advice. As an editor, would you be an advocate of qualitative experiments for corporate governance, or are there any other methods that you would suggest innovating in?
Qualitative experiments?
I'm not entirely sure what this means, qualitative experiments.
I mean, so our simulation study is, I guess, kind of a qualitative experiment, in that we manipulated some conditions. So it's experimental in that sense, and randomly assign people to conditions. And then we use qualitative methods to, at least, well, we use both quantitative and qualitative methods to analyze the progress of the discussion. So in that sense, I suppose. So as an editor, would I be an advocate? Sure. Now as an editor, would I recommend a PhD student, pursue this as their sole method of inquiry? No. It's an uphill battle. It's not something that corporate governance researchers are used to looking at. So I think it's something that is a cool option and is a good, is not a bad type of research to do to supplement a broader body of work. But no, I wouldn't die on this hill. I would not pursue this as like your raison d'etre.
Okay, one last question. Speaking of textual data analyses, what analytical techniques have you used? I have used word count software, for example, LIWC, and human coders with aggregation indices such as Cohen's kappa. But I'm curious about other alternatives.
So I'm actually working on a paper right now. It's in revision at SMJ, trying to use machine learning to take, so personally, I have only used hand coding with manual coders, which is, I did that on my dissertation, did that on some follow-on projects. It is a nightmare. You know, I'm glad I did it. Never want to do it again. And I've worked with people who have used Luke and other computer-based content analysis as well. And I think that, you know, they're good for different things. The hand coding is good for really kind of constructs that, like, if you read it, you'd know it, but it's difficult to specify actual phrases, which was the case with my dissertation data and those board chair orientations. So what we're doing is we're using we've developed a machine learning algorithm that will take my hand-coded board chair orientation data and scale it up, basically, right? It will be able to, it essentially becomes me. It looks at the pattern of coding in the data and figures out how to code the same variables from that kind of text, right? And so we can pull the text for thousands of companies, applies. Ask me absolutely no follow-on questions on how this thing works. I am not the programmer. It's magic. The thing goes in, the different things come out, is what I know about it. But I'm the theory person on this project. But that's one option as well that we hope will become. We hope to get it published, and we'll publish the code and the algorithm as well. So you can take that and apply it to any other kind of hand-coded variable that you have. And so, but beyond hand coding, term-based, keyword-based content analysis, and then this machine learning approach, that's the toolbox I got. I'm not aware of other ones. I'd be interested to learn other ones, but that's all I know.
Thanks, Ryan. I saved this question last because it leads nicely into our next talk on qualitative data analysis. So let's give Ryan a round of applause for thanking him for taking the time to share his ideas with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now our next speaker is Christina Grodell. She's going to talk about dynamic theorizing qualitative research with archival data. Stina is Distinguished Professor at Northeastern University's Leamore McKim School of Business in the Department of Entrepreneurship and Innovation. She received her PhD from Stanford University in Management Science and Engineering. Stina has developed and delivered classes globally on innovation, strategy, and decision-making to undergraduates, graduate students, and executives. Her research examines the emergence and evolution of markets and industries. She's especially interested in how firms can shape and exploit the socio-cognitive elements of markets. Her research has received numerous awards, including the EGOS Best Paper Award and the TIM Best Paper Award. Her work has been published in both management and sociology journals such as Administrative Science Quarterly, Organization Science, Academy of Management Review, Strategic Management Journals, and American Sociological Review. Her work has also been published in practitioner-oriented journals such as MIT Sloan Management Review and IESE Insight. Stina is committed to research methods. She's known for her expertise in using interviews, ethnography, and in-depth archival research, which she combines with quantitative analyses and online experiments when appropriate. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Stina.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Jason. And it's my pleasure to be here to talk about archival methods. This is actually something that is very dear to my heart and something I'm very excited about talking about. So I thought it was a great opportunity when Jason asked me to say something about this. And so my title is, the title of my talk is about dynamic theorizing with archival research, and I'll specify what I mean by this concept of dynamic theorizing throughout the talk. So when we think about doing qualitative research, most qualitative research is really focused on theory building. When we think about the role of qualitative versus quantitative research. Qualitative research is often tasked with developing new theories that quantitative theorists can then go about testing over time. And so in the past, when we did qualitative analysis, most of the tools that we used were things like ethnographies. People went out in organizations and studied them and made it field notes. Our interviews, right? People interviewed people about, those are really the two major things that people did. However, lately, people have begun to use more and more archival data. This also has to do with the fact that there now is a plethora of archival data available about nearly any organizational phenomenon that you should wish to investigate. So we have archival data from inside of organization in terms of, for example, blogs, newsletters, analyst, reports, company statements. You have user blogs, right, about users using a certain product. You have people, you have the trade magazines about what happens in markets. And so nearly whatever you're interested in, you'll be able to find archival data about it. And this archival data used to be very difficult to access because you'd have to go into a library, it might not be available in your library, right? So people didn't do this, but nowadays you can just sit at your computer at home, you can log in to your library and you have access to millions and millions and millions of documents, right? Or you can just go into the internet with your browser and you just search the internet for things about organizational phenomena, and you will find millions and millions and millions of articles that are relevant and interesting to what you're studying. And so there is this huge opportunity there, right? Because nowadays, really, what people do in inside and outside of organization, it leaves these textual traces. And we can use these textual traces to actually ask a lot of really novel and innovative research questions. However, what is lacking is a methodology for how to do this. So how do we actually go about handling all of this archival data that is now available to us as researchers? This is a question I've been asked frequently, and I'm in the midst of trying to solve this, answer this methodological problem. But any kind of feedback or thoughts that you guys have would be more than appreciated. First of all, we can think about, why do we want to use archival data? Just because it's there doesn't mean that it's useful, right? It could be there and just complete trash. Well, one of the kind of which I find in my own work, very important elements of archival research is that it actually leaves these real-time textual actions. It's really these real-time textual actions. We actually see what people do inside organizations. For example, if you're inside an organization and you study the intranet, that they have you within that organization, you see all what people are actually saying in real time. And the same could be true if you're interested in more of a market phenomenon, right? You see what are users saying, then how producers responding, what are other stakeholders responding to that, right? So in contrast to interviews where you hear people's retrospective interpretations of what happened, then in archival, a lot of archival research, you actually see organizational actions unfolding a little bit more like ethnographic observations. But these are, in a sense, a kind of ethnographic observations that can take place at multiple different levels of analysis, right? And so I think this is one of the things that I really truly love about this data, and that makes it so powerful for us in trying to study organizations, because that means that we can track organizational actions over time in this archival data. What did people actually do and what actually happened? And that allows us to see the process through which organizational phenomenon unfolds. So one advantage of archival research is this. Another one is that we are able to study a lot of things across space. Whereas if we are using ethnography, for example, we maybe want to have see those organizational actions, but if we do ethnography, we can only be in one place at one time, right? We cannot go around the world with our ethnography, but we can in archival data. Archival data allows us to move outside of the location that we have, to access data from around the world or in different states or whatever you are interested in. And so, and this is becoming also increasingly important because the world of organization is global. Nowadays, organizations are global, markets are global. If we want to study organizations and markets, we need data that is in a global format. We cannot just study an organization, what it does with, let's say, in Boston, where I'm located. We need to get data from across the world, and archival data now allows us to do this. Furthermore, archival research stretches across time. So we can actually study the evolution of things. How do things evolve over time? And we can go far back in time and access things, because nowadays a lot of organizations and a lot of libraries, they're scanning their old archives and putting them online. This means that we can trace things through an extended period of time in a way we were not able to if we were doing a traditional qualitative study. We would not be able to interview people over, let's say, a 50 or 100-year period, right? We would not be able to do an ethnography even over kind of a couple of years. Most ethnographies last maybe a year because people don't have time to spend that much time in the field. But now with archival methods, we can, right? We can study how these things evolve over time. And that is also a core element of qualitative research, is to study that particular process. It also allows us to study new phenomena, right? So phenomena that are not accessible before. For example, we might not have access to elites. What are the limitations? What are the limitations here? What are the stumbling blocks? And so a core tension has to do with exactly the thing that is the benefit of archival research can also be its hindrance, in a sense, or at least if you don't know how to handle it, is that there is this infinite availability of data, but we as humans have this limited cognitive capacity. And when we do qualitative research, normally we're used to going into these in-depth interpretive analysis of each individual text. And you're not able to do that if there's like millions. You search, you're interested in maybe corporate social responsibility in the United States, and you search and you come up with like millions and millions of documents. What are you going to do? How are you going to even start? How are you going to go about your analysis, right? So I think a lot of people never engage in archival research because they simply don't know how to start or how to go about it, because in a sense there's so much information that the tool qualitative analysis seems to not be well suited to this kind of texts. But I hope that I can at least give some kind of guidance, as I have actually done this kind of work myself several times. And so I think that the most important thing is that to develop this thing that I call dynamic theorizing. The important thing is that normally in qualitative research, when we collect our data samples, we mostly sample data in the beginning. So we go into the field, we collect our data, then we come home, we analyze our data. I think this is the wrong way of going about archival research, also because it doesn't take advantage of the idea that the data is constantly there, right? Instead, dynamic theorizing is a process where you are theorizing and sampling constantly at the same time throughout the I just realized I didn't do this. You're constantly sampling and you're constantly developing your theory. So you don't have your entire sample in the beginning. Actually, in the beginning, you start out with a very small sample. Actually, the very first step that I normally do is actually not to sample on primary data sources, but to kind of just get a kind of sense of what is going on in this particular field. What is happening right here? How can I develop an overall understanding of this phenomenon that I'm interested in? Let's say, for example, I have some work on electronic cigarettes. So the first thing I did was not to go out and collect primary data. Instead, I began to read a lot of books and blogs that other people have written about the industry. to get a sense of what is actually the whole field about. This allows me to do together with my co-author, Steve Coll, what we've called historical reconstruction. We begin to create a timeline of how does this particular phenomenon that we're interested in, how does it unfold over time? What are the major events? What is happening at one point in time? So you begin to get a skeleton, a scaffold, around which you can place your theory, and also just get a grip of what is actually going on. And this will allow you to begin to ask questions of the data. What is actually going on, right? So in electronic cigarettes, for example, we became, the current project we're working on right now, we became interested in the fact that it seems as though a lot of people were saying, a lot of people who were using electronic cigarettes were saying that actually cigarettes and e-cigarettes were not very close to one another. They were not really substitutes. So the people wanted to vape, didn't really none of want to smoke. And it was just kind of puzzling to us. It was like a question. It was something that puzzled us about the data. And once we did that, you can go back and say, okay, can I go back to the archival, to the archives and actually create a statistical random sample? So what you are doing here is, for example, you find a data source that represents your phenomenon. In my case, it is often industries, right? So for example, that could be company press releases. Okay, if you think about company press releases with regard to e-cigarettes, they're just like thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So instead of beginning to try to read through all of them, I begin by taking a statistical sample, just a small sample, for example, saying we will select 24 articles, 24 articles a year. That is like 2 every month. So we take a random sample of 2 articles every month of all of these, right? So then we have a smaller set of data. We begin to read through that and begin to try to get an understanding from this very small set of data, what is going on. Through that, we go back to existing theory to ask ourselves what is actually important, right? Why is this important? What is actually puzzling here? What is puzzling about this? What is happening here in the data? And so you might then begin to think about, what is kind of really puzzling here is how people thought about nicotine over time. So what is the role they have and their thoughts about nicotine, right? So nicotine is a theoretical construct you then find. And this is what I mean. And within this theoretical construct, you can then create a new sample. So your sampling technique differs from theoretical sampling as it's done normally in qualitative research, where we just say, oh, this is theoretically important. And so we find all the documents and interview people around this phenomenon we're interested in. It also differs from statistical random sample because there you take the whole, you'd sample on the whole thing. You wouldn't sample on a theoretical construct. And what I'm advocating here is that once you find something that you're a theoretical construct you're interested in, you create a sample about that. So if I become interested in the theoretical construct around perceptions of nicotine, I then search my bigger set of data for things that have nicotine in it, right? And so then I might have had 10,000 documents that were about e-cigarettes from, let's say, company press releases. But then I search from them, from that set, I begin to sample then and say, okay, let me only look at the ones that have something to do with nicotine, because that's the concept I've become interested in. And then that might still yield, let's say, 1,000 articles, which is too much to go through initially. Then from that, you then take a random sample and say, okay, instead of going through 1,000, I'll then, you know, so I created this theoretical sample. I then take a statistical sample from that sample, let's say 200 articles, and I begin to read through them, right? And I begin to identify initial perceptions and ideas about what are people thinking about nicotine. And so this is what I call identifying initial categories. I begin to create these theoretical constructs. However, another important construct in this process dealing with archival research is this thing I call theoretical simplicity, and which comes from the idea of Occam's razor, that the best theory is the most simple one. And this is I think this is important, honestly, in all theorizing and in qualitative theorizing in particular. It is even more important in archival theorizing, because in archival research, data is often extremely heterogeneous. So there's just a lot of different ideas and concepts in the data as such. And so if you're trying to develop a theory about everything that's in your data, your theory is going to be very complicated, and you're never going to feel that you reach kind of cohesion and saturation on your theoretical constructs. So when you are applying this theoretical simplicity, you're developing the simplest theory that you can based on your data. And so, and this process kind of, now I only have a few arrows here, but this thing kind of goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth a lot of different times throughout the research process, where you're constantly developing new constructs, then you're sampling data on that particular theoretical construct that leads you to go back to theory and develop your theory. And that might raise new questions where you have to go back to the data. And so actually I advocate that when we do archival qualitative research, we are not leaving the field. We are always going back to the data. So we are developing theory, and we are sampling from the data continuously, even nearly towards the very, very end of the research process. Because one of the things you can also do is then you go back and you try to verify the things that you have found. So this is kind of just to go into some of those elements in a little bit more detail, right? Then this problem, right, that we have in archival research is this problem of abundance, which is for qualitative researchers an interesting problem to have, because normally the problem in qualitative research has always been one of scarcity. That normally we have too few people to interview, we have too little data to actually kind of deal with, and now with archival data we actually have too much, right? And so when we think about this, it is important that we use the tools both from traditional qualitative research of this theoretical sample. We choose to study phenomenons that have theoretical importance and that have theoretical interest, right? So I begin to study e-cigarettes because it's a context that is theoretically interesting. And I begin to become interested in nicotine, right? Because it has a theoretical interest, like how people thinking about, are they addicted to this process? Are they not? Is it cool to use e-cigarettes? Why is there such a big sales of e-cigarettes at the moment, right? So I sample on that. But we cannot only do theoretical sampling because we just have too much data. So even if we just do a theoretical sample, we're still left with thousands and thousands of articles. And this is where we need to learn from quantitative scholars and also employ some of this kind of statistical sampling and going between those two. One of the big problems also with doing archival research is the concept of saturation. Normally, when we go and do traditional qualitative research, we are told that we'll stay in the field until we reach saturation. So saturation is kind of meant that you're, for example, interviewing people and you stop your interviews when you feel that your interviewees are not providing you with any new information. You kind of feel that before you go into the interview, you know what this person is going to say. This is when you're supposed to stop because you reach saturation, you're not learning anything new. The problem when you do this, employ this kind of idea with archival research is that oftentimes you're constantly learning something new because the data is very heterogeneous. And so you are often kind of you're getting data, let's say, let's say even within an organization, right? You're not just interviewing one person you're not just interviewing people who are just answering the questions you are asking them. Instead, you have this data that often talks about a lot of topics you were not interested in, but you might become interested in, right? But this can also be that's in a sense good because that's also where new research questions come from, but it can also be a problem that there's so many new things going on in the data that you never feel you reach saturation. Because let's say you are reading these company blogs and then they're talking about something, right? Technology implementation, but then they start to talk about lifestyle and work family boundaries. And that's also interesting, but that's a new theme, right? And as maybe the organization begins to have different challenges or things happen, new things come up. Then there's a COVID pandemic, right? All of a sudden, there's this new information and new topics that are appearing inside of your data. And so you're constantly being propelled towards this new data and new ideas inside of your data. So this concept of saturation in the traditional sense, I don't think that it works for archival data. This is why it's important to be, I think, as doing archival data, you need to be much more selective in terms of what is the theoretical concept I'm interested in, and I'm only going to sample on data that represent that specific concept. And then it might be that there's another story to tell, right? Most data contains hundreds of papers potentially, right? There is nearly an unlimited amount of themes that could be written from any given data set. And so having this, because the data is so heterogeneous, it is important that we are constantly thinking about reaching saturation within the theoretical construct and not on the entire data set, right? Which falls out very different. That's why this theorizing and sampling needs to be dynamic, the way that I showed it on the figure before. Right, and this is why we kind of, as I mentioned, we need to kind of cycle through and go back and sample new. Once we have a kind of new idea, we will sample on that particular idea until we feel we've solved it, or we realize that there's something else we don't know, and we'll create a mini sample for that. So in a sense, instead, whereas in traditional maybe research in general and in qualitative research in particular, we have kind of one big sample. In archival research, you'll end up with many small samples. And these samples each represent a theoretical construct that you are interested in. So it could be a theme around email, for example, and you could, you could sample on people's email use. It could be work, family boundaries. It could be the COVID pandemic, right? You could have in different, depending on what the themes are inside of the model and the thing you're interested in, you will have small samples associated with them. Right, and in choosing that and in figuring out what are then going to be these theoretical constructs, we need to be guided by this theoretical simplicity, because honestly, it's the most, I mean, I'm now a review for a lot of journals, and I'd say that in 95% of the papers that I get, and also that the comment, one of the first comment from the reviewers always on a qualitative paper is that you're trying to do too much in this paper. It's too complicated, right? I mean, so it's just the most important thing when doing qualitative research is to try to create a very simple understanding. That simple understanding can then always be kind of expanded and blown up. But at least you need to try initially to say, well, if I have two ways of explaining my phenomenon and one is simpler than the other, then I'm going to go with a simple one. If the other one only adds a little bit to my explanation, I need to go with a simple explanation. So constantly be striving towards that theoretical simplicity. So just to kind of go back to the model, I hope it makes a little bit more kind of sense to you what this process kind of is, what this process is like and how it might unfold, that we are constantly moving between the theory and the sampling. And so down here, I only have kind of as though there's one sample, but they could actually be, I'd see be multiplied so that you have more and more and more and more samples over here. As you kind of build your model, your theoretical model, you might actually have a little data set that represents data that supports each of the theoretical constructs inside of your theoretical model that you're trying to build within your qualitative your qualitative paper. And I want to mention here in the end that one thing I think is also very important about archival research is that it allows us to do systematic coding. This is something that not all qualitative scholars do, and I think it has to do with the fact that if you, for example, doing interviews, you cannot do systematic coding. At least it's much harder to do. But one of the glories of archival research is that it lends itself very well to track things over time, very specifically. So we are able to combine some more kind of quantitative, descriptive phenomena together with an in-depth qualitative understanding of what happens inside the paper. And so this has been done very well in certain papers like Navis and Glenn's study of the NASQ's study of satellite radio, or Bingham and Carl's study of the evolution of the computer. So just to kind of summarize here, I think that really when we think about archival research, there's a huge opportunity there. I really think that the opportunity is enormous for people who interested in qualitative analysis to use archival data. First of all, this thing, as I said, to study real-time actions, to study use archival research across time, to study how things unfolded during a very long period in time, use archival research across space, study how the same thing was happening in different locations, or to study new phenomenon that we otherwise don't have access to. For example, disease-stricken areas, where we could not go, war zones, we would not be able to study because of the dangers, but now we can, because some of these places might actually leave a textual data trace that we can then go and look at real time or after the fact. But as I mentioned, there's this core tension that too much availability of data and that we as humans have this limited cognitive capacity. And the way to kind of solve that problem is to engage in this theoretical theorizing through both dynamic sampling and this theoretical simplicity. I think if you do that over time, you are able to use archival data to ask some of these new questions. So that was all from me. I hope that there is maybe some questions as well.
Thank you, Christina. The first question is about applying dynamic theorizing. So in applying dynamic theorizing to an actual practice of the journal paper writing, would you recommend that we frame each step, for example, historical reconstruction, identifying initial categories, as a separate study, or have a grand qualitative study that consists of multiple steps in it, like we usually do in a traditional qualitative study?
I mean, I see this dynamic theorizing as being a method that you use inside one single paper, right? So like if you go back, then you would say inside the paper, let's say in your method paper, you'd say, okay, I began by doing historical reconstruction. That led me to identify this problem as being important. Then I identify some puzzles, you know, and so this led me to ask these particular questions and to develop these constructs inside of my theoretical model, right? Most qualitative papers end up with a theoretical model, right? So your methods paper, in a sense, just needs to tell the reader, how did you get to that model? How did you get from the data analysis into the model? What were the steps you took that allowed you to read through the data and then get to that theoretical construct that you ended up with, right? And so, yes, I see this as something that is happening inside a paper. You do this kind of dynamic theorizing in one paper, and it's the process you go through in order to develop your process model.
The next question is probably applicable to many of our doctoral students. So could you recommend some step-by-step materials to learn archival data analysis?
Yeah, I mean, there's not that much out there. Unfortunately, I'm actually trying to write this up into a kind of a paper because many people asked me to do that. It might be helpful. Then I had a recent kind of this AMR paper that was published generally on qualitative analysis. I actually also think that Anne Langley's 1999 AMR paper on process theorizing is very useful also for archival methods, because it also says that, I think this thing about starting, she also advocates, she uses a different way of talking about it, but really this idea that you need to start with historical reconstruction or making some kind of scaffold upon which you can build your theory. So her paper is great. Together with my co-author Steve Call and I have this paper also on multi-level discourse analysis that was published in SMJ. That's also a methods paper, and that paper also kind of lays out some ideas about how can you use archival textual analysis and analyze it qualitatively.
Thank you. I'm sharing the link to the Langley paper here. Another question is about sampling. So do you just, it's about statistical sampling from theoretical sampling. Do you just select a certain percentage of articles focused on a given theory or topic?
Yes, so I mean, it has to make sense. Again, like you need to think about this in your context, right? What makes sense here, right? So normally normally what I do is not a percentage. Normally I do a certain, for example, 2 in a certain time period, because oftentimes if you do a percentage, depending on the phenomenon of study, your underlying data often has, for example, an exponential curve, right? So let's say you're studying what people think about the COVID pandemic, and right in the very beginning of the pandemic, there's nearly no articles around it, right? And then you see this exponential growth. And so if you take a percentage sampling approach, you will never learn anything about the early period, right? Because most of the data is going to happen during that kind of peak period. But maybe the early period actually particularly important, right? And it's interesting to understand, what did people think about the COVID pandemic in the very, very beginning, right? And so what I do is more of a kind of a sampling in time periods. So you take a random sample during a certain specified point in time. So for example, 2 articles every month, right? If it's something that evolves over time, because then you don't run into this particular problem that you know, sometimes if there's, I mean, but that of course depends a little bit on what your research question is, right? And so I don't think there's just one way to do this. You need to use your mind in order to think about, okay, how do I, what am I actually interested in showing here, right? And what then should be my sampling technique?
So one last question. It's a pretty broad one. So we are trying to study the impact of COVID-19 micro enterprises in India and using archival data. And we are targeting a couple of conferences. So I would really appreciate any reference or any insight you may have on using archival data. So again, it's a pretty broad question about this.
I think that if one was to study something like the COVID pandemic, right? It depends. I mean, that is a really interesting problem. It's also a very broad one, right? And there it becomes very important to go into that research setting with a particular question, right? At least an initial interest in something specific about it. And now I don't know what their interest is, right? But something that would allow you to take this very, very broad phenomenon and make it a more specific kind of question, right? And so in the COVID pandemic, it could be, what are doctors' responses, right? So how does the medical profession, you know, react to, you know, to the COVID pandemic, for example, right? And so that you have some kind of into it. And then you can begin to say, okay, if I'm interested in that, right, doctors, then I could begin to identify where do doctors communicate about the COVID pandemic. There might be certain blogs, There might also just be the scientific journals, right? In the front, for example, the front page, the front end of scientific journals, like the Journal of the American Medical Association, right? They would have some kind of debates, and I'm sure that some of them were about COVID. Then you can begin to collect those over time, again, taking some kind of, maybe you want all of the early period in time, right? Saying in the beginning, I simply take everything that's there. And we would have some kind of a sampling technique that's, again, saying you took 2 articles every month, but in the beginning, there are not 2 articles every month. So you're going to end up with a whole sample, right? During the early period in time, and then you begin to kind of sample, and you begin to read that and think about, you know, what is actually going on here? How are these medical professionals thinking about the COVID pandemic? And maybe how has it changed over time? What did they think in the very beginning, right? Where they maybe just like, oh, this is not going to be anything. There are kind of flus all the time. There are new kind of viral illnesses all the time. We've lived through millions of these, so, you know, this is probably not something serious. Are they going to be, oh my God, this is just like SARS? And if this is SARS, this is going to be like a global pandemic. Like, and who did that? Like, who thought what at what point in time, right? I mean, this was the kind of way that I would approach this topic. Again, I think that it would be very important. I think that in qualitative research, and in particular with archival data, it's important to have a very narrow problem, in a sense, in the beginning, because that problem can nearly always be broadened out because there's so much data. The problem is nearly the reverse, right? It's not a problem that your question is not big enough. It's a problem is too big and you can't write a paper about it, right? So you start small, even a very small problem. And then if you feel it's too small, you can always broaden it out and collect more data. I think that's just the beauty, and why I honestly personally love working with this kind of archival data, is that when you have a new idea, you just collect more data, you know? So you realize, oh, maybe it's about X, right? Maybe the thing that's actually going on here and really important in the data is X. I go and collect the data on it because it's there, versus if you've left the field and you can't really go back and do more interviews, or if you've done a survey, for example, the survey is just set in stone, right? Or you've done an online experiment. I've done all of these kind of papers myself as well, right? So then it's just set in stone and there's not much you can do, you know, you're kind of stuck. But with archival data, if you have something where you feel like, whoa, I really didn't understand that the problem in understanding the dynamics of the COVID pandemic and how doctors responded was their relationship to the American Medical Associations and how what they communicated, that doctors were looking towards that. Let me then I just go into the archives of the American Medical Association, and I begin to collect all of their articles, and I can see it from their perspectives, right? And so this is how the research process can kind of unfold over time. But I just think it's very important to start small, and so that it doesn't blow up in your face. And because that's I'm just seeing it many times. Talk with many PhD students where the biggest problem is, I think, in all of qualitative research, is that it gets unwieldy and there's too much data and there's too many constructs. And too many codes, and none of it kind of comes together in a theory. And which is why I think that this idea also about theoretical simplicity is extremely important. Start with something small, right? Something that's uncomplicated. The more uncomplicated, the more, even if it seems like too simplified, it's better to start there. You can always make it more complicated as you move along. Whereas the other process is actually weirdly maybe harder.
Thank you for sharing your expertise. Let's give Christina a round of applause, clapping, if you will. I really appreciate your engagement throughout this session, and I personally learned a lot today, and I hope it's been a good experience for you. So one last thing, a reminder, our next session will be Tuesday next week, starting at the same time, using the same link. And I'm sharing the email addresses for our speakers, and their contact information is available online. But if you have any follow-up questions or have any ideas for collaboration, feel free to reach out to the speakers. All right, thanks again, and I'll figure out the recording soon and share with you, and you can view it later on. Thanks again.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Take care.